Right, let's jump straight into this explainer. The Trump administration had an absolutely massive week, issuing a flurry of specific executive orders, fact sheets, and legislative updates that touch almost every single corner of the American economy. From the medication you pick up at the pharmacy to the geopolitical landscape of global trade, these aren't just minor bureaucratic tweaks we're talking about here. These are major structural shifts. So we're going to look really closely at these actions, cut through the noise, and analyze what the practical, real-world outcomes will actually be for everyday Americans, for corporate balance sheets, and for the broader financial system.
To really grasp the scale of these maneuvers, we've got to look at the government's Intel stock stake, which has just surged to over $50 billion. The administration secured a 10% equity stake in the iconic American chipmaker last August. What we are looking at right now is a massive, nearly 500% cumulative total return since the start of 2025. Financially, this is a huge windfall for the government's balance sheet, and it serves as this major financial anchor for the administration's whole narrative about a domestic manufacturing resurgence. It sets a very specific economic backdrop for the rest of the policies we're about to explore.
Because there is so much to cover, we've structured this explainer into 4 key pillars: healthcare and society, deregulation in the economy, the financial system, and global trade. Let's get into it.
Starting off with Pillar 1, Healthcare and Society, we're going to look at newly announced initiatives targeting domestic health and social programs.
The big number you need to know here is 600. The expansion of TrumpRx.gov is now going to feature over 600 generic medications for everyday use. We're talking about highly common prescriptions, things like atorvastatin for cholesterol, lisinopril for high blood pressure, and metformin for diabetes. These are medications that tens of millions of Americans literally take every single day just to stay healthy.
The mechanics of this are pretty fascinating. We could be sitting here discussing systemic overhauls like guaranteed healthcare for all or capping all out-of-pocket costs, but instead we're looking at a purely market-based transparency initiative. The stated goal from the administration is to let Americans compare cash prices against their insurance copays to drive competition. By pulling private discount programs like Amazon Pharmacy, Cost Plus Drugs, and GoodRx into one federal portal, this ultimately shifts the burden of finding the lowest price directly onto the consumer. It bypasses the insurance middlemen, which, for sure, could save money for savvy patients paying out of pocket, but it doesn't actually change the underlying structural cost of healthcare delivery itself.
Alongside healthcare, we also saw the House pass the Fostering the Future Act. This is rooted in the First Lady's 4 community-centric pillars for America's youth. The administration was quick to highlight this unanimous bipartisan passage. The focus here is on providing unmovable educational foundations and inspiring career ambition for youth currently in the foster care system. The ultimate goal? Breaking the cycle of homelessness and poverty for vulnerable kids by creating structured pathways to entry-level employment and true independence.
Okay, moving right along to Pillar 2, deregulation and the domestic economy. A major theme we're seeing here is rolling back previous environmental rules to try and address consumer costs.
For example, the administration is directly reversing prior rules on refrigerators and air conditioners. On May 21st, they terminated Biden-era regulations that mandated strict hydrofluorocarbon and leak repair limits on large-scale refrigeration systems. The administration's stated rationale is that these strict environmental safeguards were driving up the price of transporting and storing refrigerated goods. In practice, this is a very direct trade-off. They are rolling back environmental protections and emissions reductions specifically to lower the operating and maintenance costs for supermarkets, transport companies, and semiconductor manufacturers.
And according to the latest fact sheet, the projected outcome of this added flexibility is a savings of $2.4 billion for Americans, plus the safeguarding of 350,000 jobs. But we really need to look at the core economic reality of this. That $2.4 billion represents a reduction in corporate compliance and equipment costs. So the real question is, do everyday Americans actually see those savings? Well, that depends entirely on whether grocery stores and transport companies choose to pass those lowered operating costs down to you at the checkout aisle, or if they just absorb them into their own operating margins to benefit the players at the top. On the domestic front, the administration is also heavily emphasizing infrastructure and beautification ahead of the 250th anniversary coming up in 2026. Framing the initiative under the banner, "Decline is a Choice," a ton of resources are currently being funneled into classical restoration and urban landscaping. This basically positions aesthetic infrastructure as a core component of both national pride and economic revitalization in the capital.
All right, Pillar 3, the financial system and immigration. We're going to examine a highly specific May 19th executive order that directly intertwines financial regulation with immigration status.
Looking directly at the text of this order, the Treasury is being directed to alter Bank Secrecy Act regulations to identify red flags, things like off-the-books wage payments, and to strengthen customer due diligence. The order very specifically targets the use of individual taxpayer identification numbers, or ITINs, as well as foreign consular identification cards. By flagging these as risks for illicit finance and unlawful employment, the administration is effectively deputizing the banking sector to monitor and ultimately restrict the financial activities of non-work authorized immigrants.
Now, this is where the real on-the-ground effects come into play. The order directs the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to treat the risk of deportation and wage loss as valid factors in denying loans to undocumented immigrants. Let's break down what this actually means for regular people. Under the guise of enforcing ability to repay standards, this legally normalizes shutting undocumented individuals completely out of the credit system. If you lack legal work authorization, getting a mortgage, getting an auto loan, or even getting a basic credit card is going to become structurally nearly impossible. While the administration argues this protects banks from bad debt, the real effect is that it structurally pushes millions of vulnerable individuals out of the formal banking sector entirely, forcing them into cash-only underground economies. Finally, let's dive into Pillar 4. Global trade and foreign policy. While domestic policy heavily focused on deregulation, foreign policy was rooted in some massive economic deal-making.
Managed by the newly formed U.S.-China Boards of Trade and Investment, some absolutely massive specific commitments were secured. We're talking everything from 200 Boeing aircraft to billions in agriculture. Following a state visit to Beijing, the administration locked in an agreement where China will purchase at least $17 billion a year of U.S. agricultural products through 2028, and they'll restore market access for American beef and poultry. For the American heartland, this translates to a huge cash injection and market stabilization, particularly for farmers. It's also a major boost for domestic manufacturing jobs in the aviation sector. On top of that, securing commitments on rare earth minerals directly impacts the American tech and semiconductor industries, essentially ensuring that supply chains don't get interrupted. To round out the week, the administration also formalized several incredibly strict foreign policy and defense stances right alongside these economic treaties. Let's look at how this builds on their broader geopolitical strategy. While extending an economic olive branch to China on trade, the U.S. simultaneously secured shared commitments regarding the denuclearization of North Korea and making sure the Strait of Hormuz stays open. Conversely, the administration took a much harder line closer to home, imposing powerful new sanctions on Cuba's military and intelligence apparatus, which effectively severs financial lifelines to the Cuban regime. So as we wrap up this explainer, we are looking at an administration pulling some very powerful levers. They are relying on consumer transparency instead of systemic reform for drug prices. They're rolling back environmental rules to cut corporate costs, aggressively restricting credit access for undocumented immigrants, and using massive trade leverage to inject capital into American agriculture and manufacturing. The true test of all this, whether the intended benefits of these incredibly sweeping actions actually reach the pockets of regular Americans, or if they just rewrite the rules for the people already at the top. Keep questioning the policies shaping your future. We'll catch you on the next one.